important concept where we are going to understand from the foundations of how does a servlet work and how it's related to authorization and authentication. So now what you see is a web server here, and this web server, we are going to load a component back in it. People knew how to process HTTP request and response, but that was without the Java technology. So when Java technology came in, the servlets came in, and servlet is nothing but it is based on Java APIs, and we had this exercise of coding servlets and then deploying this to web servers. So what we do is we deploy this to web servers. Now when we deploy servlets to web servers, how do you deploy? You know that the web server is a uh, very important part of the system which accepts the HTTP request and processes and gives us the HTTP response, right? So in a very simple way, and it gives us the HTTP response. HTTP response. I don't want to make this video necessarily long, but at the same time, I want to build a very fundamental concepts in understanding authorization and authentication. So the way we deploy servlets is that what we do is that when we give HTTP request, the web server needs to know it's just an agent to accept HTTP request. It's not going to process everything. So in order to process this request, web server has to redirect the request somewhere. So if it has to redirect the request to my servlet, how does it do this? So for that, we had something known as web.xml. So in the web.xml, we gave all that configurations which would help web server redirect the request to servlets. Servlets would process the request and give it back to web server. And web server gives the HTTP response back to the client. This is your client who gives a request, and call this as a browser or client. HTTP request is given to web server processes the request and gives the response. So this is very typical old-fashioned way people used to work, right? So we had a web.xml. Now the question is, what does this web.xml contain? How can I specify that if the HTTP request is given by browser uh, and web server, how does it refer web.xml to redirect the request to servlets? And how does it take the response and give it back to us? What is this web.xml? So, so now we are going to discuss more about basically uh, we're going to talk about more about what is a web server, what is web.xml. So share sound screens. Sorry. So what exactly is web.xml? Web.xml is information which you give, which provides you configuration and deployment information for the web components. So what is servlet? Servlet is a web component. Now, the Java servlet specification defines the web.xml deployment descriptor file in terms of XML schema. Now, the language through which we give information about configuration and deployment of a web component is through XML schema, and this is typical way in XML the configuration and deployment of a web component occurs. And all these schema definitions are there defined. What's filter, what's init parameter, and all that stuff is defined here. So when you define the servlet, the request comes, the web server looks here, and if the request comes on port 80, we can see that for this particular servlet at port 80 you would get the servlet class, which is written here, servlet, cert, welcome servlet. There is a listener, there is a forwarded servlet, there is servlet error page, and so on. So now the question comes is that after doing this, what exactly happens? And now we saw this that the HTTP request is given to web server, so it is seen as a web component. It is deployed using web.xml, where all this is defined. If you are interested to know more deep about this, I mean, I know people, the recent Java developers, they do have something servlets in their syllabus prescribed in universities or in their graduation courses. But the very important thing to understand here is what is this relationship between this web.xml and the Spring Boot framework. That is very important to understand because that will help you, to get basic concepts when you talk about Spring Boot. So in Spring Boot earlier, the configurations was in XML, then they shifted over to annotations. But behind the line Spring Boot also, you need to realize that it runs a servlet, and a lot of things happen automatically for you. You are just running on Spring Boot, but suddenly you find that Tomcat is coming up. Then at the REST controller, you find that there are servlets and the security filter chaining and all that stuff. So when you get a request, the web.xml, if you are specifying filters, then your requests are intercepted by filters. And it's very important to understand how those filters help you in authentication and authorization, because most of the times, most of the videos, what they do is they take you directly to Spring Boot, and then they show you how to download the Spring Boot with the necessary dependencies, and then they go directly to configure like Zuul Gate or Eureka server. But the basic core concepts behind them, most of the videos do not discuss because they are time bound maybe, or that's not the focus of the video. But we have to understand how we come from very basic concepts to this one. Otherwise, you do not understand the rationale behind why what things are brought of them. Now this is showing you the .xml in detail, which talks about one of the annotations what we use. Before that, we have to go and check this web app. The web.xml has opening tab web app and close that with web apps, saying this is a web application component. And then you have the servlet here, which is an example of servlet, and then you have a role inside that. So this tag is very important, security role. It's opening with security role reference, and then it closes with security role reference. It's giving a role name as local manager, and then role link as manager. So this is one way we used to give the link, the configuration in web.xml. And now how is it? It is having just one component when we start with Spring Boot, and that is Spring Boot Application. And now the question here is that add Spring Boot Application. Add Spring Boot Application. This is what we use when we start our Spring Boot application. Now, add Spring Boot application consists of what all annotations. That is what I'm discussing. Where to use this add Spring Boot application? You see a Spring Boot application here now, and what we have is this annotation, add Spring Boot application. A lot of things go behind when we just give this at add Spring Boot application. Of course, this is a REST controller, and in a very simple sense, what it does is that it's going to receive requests where the HTTP requests where you will have the server name, the port, and then it will append this URL equal student name, and this is a request mapping. And what happens is that this is a method where you are asking Spring Boot application to return just the hello name with a response, and with the date. Now the question here is that add request mapping and giving. So what exactly does this mean? It's a get call or put call or post call. So basically what we are doing is this is a get call where you give request mapping. I'm not going to go more into REST-based methods here, but my focus would be on Spring Boot application and what exactly happens. This, if you see this, from where it is imported is that it's imported from autoconfig.springboot application. So this is the Spring Boot application we are talking now. What is going on is that at the Spring Boot application, it has in turn so many annotations, right? It has add component scan, it has add enable auto configuration, and it has add Spring Boot configuration. So what do they in turn do is that they make sure that whatever definitions are there for this servlet, like for example, you're defining the roles here, and you have to make sure that your web app, whatever is there, this particular web.xml is on a particular web server. It could be on your WebSphere server or WebLogic server. As long as you have the standard definitions of web deployment descriptor, web deployment descriptor should work on a WebLogic or WebSphere without any problems. But here you just declare add Spring Boot. So behind the line, it is auto configuring, doing a configuration of Tomcat for you. And in the class path, if it is doing an auto configuration, it does configure a Tomcat for you. This is what it says. If you have Spring Boot starter web, right? And then it also includes Spring Boot configuration, and it marks the class as source of bean definitions for the application context. Then it does a component scan. Which does a scanning of your package of your main class and sub packages. Plus, it tries to find your components, add component, add service, add repository, add controller, blah, blah, those things. That's why, when you say add REST controller, it knows that where to find the REST controller. Application, it's the application. And application is having your Spring Boot servlet and all. It is, it's your web app, which can, take HTTP request and then, it can give a HTTP response. What is and authentication. So authorization means what? Is the user authorized to do what? Is authorized to approve, or is authorized to only review? Is authorized to make changes? Those things. Those are basically rules, right? That means that I will redirect this request to basically something known as a gateway. Zuul gateway is the example we'll discuss here. There are a lot of gateways, but we'll mostly focus on Zuul gateway. And it goes to Zuul gateway here. Now, as soon as it goes to a gateway, why do we keep gateways? That's an important question. Why do I need to have a gateway, to find out about the authorization and authentication? Now, generally, what happens is that you just don't have one web app in an organization, right? If this is your organization, you will have so many web apps. So this is one web app. You have another web app here. Okay. So all those requests, if this particular web app needs something from this web app or backend service, it cannot go and directly hit this. It has to go to a gateway for authorization. Because any web app, any API, when it is set, it has to be hit by valid and authenticated user. So in order to make sure that any request, when it travels, it is secured. It cannot just hit anything randomly. So it goes to a Zuul gateway. It might go to this Zuul gateway, or it has its own Zuul gateway, right? So let's say for this timing, we'll have one single Zuul gateway. Now, in this Zuul gateway, what happens is this again in turn is going to go to it will follow something like OAuth2 authentication. So if it follows OAuth2 authentication, then OAuth2 works in two ways. One is it could get a JWT token, which contains all the details of roles and also expiry, or it's kind of plain vanilla open authentication where it will get tokens from a token server. And when the tokens it gets token, the Zuul gateway says, yeah, this guy is an authorized user, and then it passes this with the roles and responsibilities back to this. And then, in the web app, inside the web app methods, I would have configured maybe each service with different roles. And if this particular user is having admin role, then in a method, I would have, give the response only if it's a role of admin, then the response is given. Now, but how do you make this entire setup work? That's the question. So I know this video is becoming very long, but the intent here is, to take you from basic concepts to here, understand the annotations today, what we use, because I've seen that most of the people, when they first time use the annotation at Spring Boot, it starts Tomcat for them and all. They feel very comfortable, but they do not understand the kind of the inherent complex tasks which we have, right? Like for example, I want to break that all you give me in Ultimate. I don't want Tomcat server. I want WebSphere. How do I do that? You have no idea until you understand these concepts. So if you need, instead of Tomcat, you need WebSphere. How do I do that? Yeah, you would Google, you would do a chat GPT, you would get the answers quickly. The question is that after getting those answers, have you really understood what is going inside that? If some issue is there, if you want to troubleshoot, you are not getting the answers for that. Then you have to do a lot of troubleshooting. So that's why I'm taking this video from very basic concepts, from servlets to web server, web.xml to Zuul gateway web app. So now we will see example of a filter chain is formed in a servlet. So this is basically a diagram which will tell you that you have servlets deployed in your web server. Then you have the filter chains, you have a client HTTP request coming in, and the servlet's processing, and then the other receiving the response. Now, overall, you need to understand one thing is that the configuration of rules or authorization is done in this filter chain. How does this filter chain look? How does the web.xml look? Is this an example? You would put a filter here, and then in the filter you are mentioning which is your filter name, which is the filter login class, what is the initialization parameter that class would take. After doing this filter, you have to map this filter. So in the filter mapping, you are mentioning that this is your login filter, and this is the URL pattern for the security check. So this is an example of how you do a servlet. You are using filter chain. But when it comes to Spring Boot, you have to become more comfortable, because this is like more work when you are actually deploying servlets and you are using web server and filter chain. So this is what it happens in Spring, right? You have authentication, you have Spring security filters, you have security context, then your authentication manager, the authentication providers, and password. This is what it happens in Spring security. But remember one thing is that even when Spring came initially, one had to do all this manually. So this is Spring security filters. How do you do that? This is an example in your web.xml. Where you put your filter as Spring security filter chain. And then you start delegating the approving and authorization to delegating filter proxy. So this is your filter mapping and filter name. And then any URL which starts with /*, right? It has to go through this Spring security filter chain. This is where your start of the authentication or authorization happens. But now what we are seeing here, it is more advanced than what we are talking. In SpringBoot application, what happens is that the servlet, which is by default, which is there in SpringBoot framework, which they call it the dispatcher servlet, it will make sure that the servlet is deployed on Tomcat. Now you see that the Spring Boot auto configuration, and it is making sure that you have Tomcat if you're Spring Boot starter web. That's why you include Spring Boot starter web in your configuration, the label configuration, where you mentioned this dependency. Now remember one thing that you must have understood, that if you want to exclude that, if you can exclude your Spring Boot starter web, but will exclude your Tomcat, and then you can mention the dependency on WebSphere, And when you do that, you just have to mention the WebSphere. That's it. And Spring is going to auto-configure WebSphere server for us. So that's the way the SpringBoot is working for it. SpringBoot application. After doing that, now I defined a REST controller at SpringBoot application. Now I also talked about including a gateway. Where was I talking about that is this is what I'm talking about is that you have SpringBoot web app. Now your request has to go through the Zuul gateway. Zuul gateway in turn has to contact the token server, and then you have to connect to a token server and get authorized token. So that is where we are going to talk about now. So now this is your Spring Gateway we have defined. So this is the service, Spring Gateway service. We defined application.parameters. We defined a port as 8090. And now we're going to go here. We're going to start the Zuul gateway. How do you start the Zuul gateway? You just enable Zuul proxy in your Spring Boot application. This is going to start you a Zuul gateway. Now, what happens is when you start the Zuul gateway, you're going to hit from your server. So let's do one thing. Let's start the service. Let me see. So this is my Zuul server, and enable the Zuul proxy, and then I have defined the filters here. There is a pre-filter, post-filter, error filter, and route filter. What I'm doing is that so I have a very simple REST controller here, and in the REST controller, I am having a Spring Boot application, which is going to do very simple things. Basically, if I give echo student name and the name, whatever is that, it will tell me hello. But this Spring Boot application, I need to mention that the Zuul gateway for this. So how do I make sure that the request which is being goes to this particular REST controller, goes to the gateway what I'm going to start the Zuul gateway. That configuration we need to look at it now. And you see the application properties. I'm giving the server port as 8090. And if you see my application properties for Zuul, what happens is that I've given a Zuul root here. This is very important configuration for Zuul. It is not enough if you just start a Zuul server with @enable Zuul proxy, right? Or if you just define these filters. Inside you give the routing, Zuul.routes. So as soon as the first route what you gave, when you give /student, you're routing the localhost 8090 with this extra part after that. So it will go here to Zuul route.url localhost 8090. So Ribbon is a Eureka server which is enabled. We'll disable it, and then we'll start this server port with 8080. So observe that the application properties here is 8090 for our Spring Boot server, which is our application, and the application properties for Spring Boot Zuul is 8080. So let's do one thing is let's first start our Spring Boot Zuul. After starting the Spring Zuul boot, we are going to start when we started all this. You can see the logs. I started on 8080. Now we're going to start the application. So it started on 8090. Now I should hit 808090. So this is now giving me a response. Then I'm going to see profile, student profile. This is one of the calls I gave. You could give another calls here, get student details. I could give equal student name. Right now it's giving me an error. There is no explicit mapping for this. But if I was expecting that if I give get student details and the name, I should get something. And now it's very important that you realize that your Zuul port is 8080 and the Zuul route for student is 8090. So what are you going to do is that since your application property is 8090, you're going to hit this port 8090. And what is it is supposed to do is that this is your SpringBoot application, which is nothing but a get call. If I give slash equal student and give the name, say going to return hello response on, and then it's going to give me a date. So this is what I'm doing now. If I enter say my name on here, so it is responding this. And if I give echo student name, slash, so now it's perfectly configured to respond. So that now what I'm going to do is that
Hello,
I'm going to
my name is Adam Ferrari,
bring
Chief
it down
Executive Officer of Phoenix Energy.
the
I
gateway
look
server.
forward to
Then what
you joining
happens?
us at our next investor webinar, where you can drill
That's
deeper
the question.
into our 9 to 13%
Now, how do I
annual
bring
interest rate
down
bond
the
offerings
gateway server?
and see how our company has become an emerging leader in the oil and gas industry. In 2024, Phoenix Energy rose to become the 11th most prolific oil and gas operator in the Williston Basin, one of America's top producing regions. We are now right alongside industry giants like ConocoPhillips and EOG and plan to continue rising in the rankings. Our daily production rates have risen as high as 18,000 barrels of oil per day. We've sold more than 4 million barrels, and we're just getting started. We hope to see you at our brief webinar. In less than 1 hour, you will learn more about our 9 to 13% annual interest rate bond offerings and the U.S. oil and gas sector. These Regulation D 506E bond offerings are open to accredited investors.
So now we are not running Zuul gateway proxy. I'm going to run only the Spring Torrent service here. Let's start the service. I'm going to start this service now. As our application. Observe the port number on which it starts. And then it has started the Spring Boot service on 8090. So let's see now. Can we access this? Last time when we accessed this, it gave me a response. Does it give a response to me? Okay, now to serve that. It's giving me a response 8090. Started on 8090. There's no port 80 here. So we have defined the routes here. So if you do local 8090, it works. But it itself is having a server port as 8080. Let's make this false. Then if I hit on 8080, what happens? It's refusing. So now let's go first through. I have started both of the applications here. I have started the Spring Boot Gateway Proxy application, and I have started the Spring Boot Student Service application. Both of them I have started. Now let's go through the configuration once again and understand what we have done. So when I say Zuul roots.student.url equals http colon double slash localhost colon 8090. This is my Zuul root. And then if I say that my Zuul is running on 8080, which means that if I give the port number of the Zuul and give the URLs which are configured here, like echo student name and all, then they should work. Which also means that, if I, let's test this first, let's test if echo student is working correctly or not, right? On the browser. Now, if I give just 8090, and then if I say, I'm getting a response, but this is just a Spring Boot application without proxy. So where is my proxy running? It is running on 8080, right? So if I say 8080, would it work? No. Why does not work? Because I need to give here, let's go back to properties file. And what I say is that I need to give localhost 8090. So now we have the student URL as http slash localhost. So what does this mean? That if I give http colon localhost colon 8080 slash student, and then any of these paths which are configured here in the REST controller, it should work, right? So I'm going to give 8080 slash student, and then I give the slash, it should work, correct? So it's both the servers running, echo student. Now I'm going to give get student details. Why it does not work? Is it student or students? Yes. So echo student name slash and it gives me the response. Let's try this one. Get student details slash ANR. Why get students is not working? I don't know. Get student details. We have to see what the problem is for the second URL, but the first URL does work. So this is working now since we have directed the request to 8080. So it so get students is working, and then we have eco student which is also working. Eco student details, eco student name. So this is the one which is eco student. So both are working with 8080. Now what remains? What we have achieved here now is that we have a web app and then we have connected to Zuul Gateway. We were able to route request to a Zuul Gateway. Now the Zuul Gateway has to connect to a token server and get a valid token. So that's what we'll work on now. So now we are going to think about this token server. That also we are going to build using Spring Boot, and we will try to use Google as our source for tokens. So what exactly is OAuth2 is? Let's try to understand that, and then let's go from there. So we're going to do a Maven project for the authentication resource